Hi everyone, and welcome to this video on racism. This presentation is going to cover the different levels of racism, going over each one separately. So the first level involves individual acts of racism. The second is at the institutional level, and the third is at the structural level. So let's go over individual racism first. These are acts perpetrated by individuals against people of color based on conscious and or subconscious acceptance of white superiority. So this last part is key. There is a belief in the superiority of one race and the inferiority of another race. In this case, we're talking about the belief that those who have Anglo-Saxon European ancestry are superior than those who don't have that ancestry. And when I say conscious and subconscious, this really has to do with overt versus covert racism. One way to think about the difference between overt and covert racism is to imagine an iceberg. And by the way, I take no credit for this analogy. I don't know who first created this, but I've recreated it here. I'm not taking credit for it. Okay, so we have an iceberg, and only part of that iceberg is showing above the waterline. However, if we look at that part that's showing, it's a much smaller amount than what's below the waterline. So overt racism includes things like lynching, racist jokes, hate crimes, slurs, neo-Nazism, displaying swastikas, Confederate flags, and other symbols of racism. The KKK, for example, and burning crosses. All of this is overt, right? We see it, we can point to it, and call it racism. But there's also covert racism. Some examples of covert racism include racist mascots, self-appointed allyship, make America great again, denying that racism exists, blaming the victim of racism, having a white savior complex, not challenging racist jokes, denying the existence of white privilege, tokenism, colorblindness. When folks say, well, I never owned slaves, so this isn't my fault. What do you expect me to do about it? Expecting people of color to educate white people about racism, cultural appropriation, claiming reverse racism, fearing people of color, and celebrating holidays like Columbus Day. So if we look above the color line, ooh, that was a Freudian slip. I meant look above the waterline. We see these examples of overt racism, which are based on white superiority or the beliefs in white superiority. We can see that these are all actions that are considered socially unacceptable. Everything below the waterline is considered socially acceptable. In other words, when these things happen, they're rarely called out. That's the difference between overt racism and covert racism at the individual level. So it's one person or a group of people doing it against another person or a group of people. Then we have institutional racism. And this has to do with racism that exists within the institutions, within the systems of society. But the key here is that it's happening within one system. Now that can be a little bit confusing because we're talking about different systems, but let me give you some examples and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, let's take a look at the education system, for example. So within this one system, we have disparities by race and ethnicity. Most of this has to do with the fact that about half, or 44%, of funding to schools is based on property taxes, local property taxes. So if we look at this figure here, we can see that the median net worth of households is what determines what the property taxes are going to be. Because in our country, net worth is usually based on home ownership. So this means that communities that have high property values are going to have more funding for their schools. Disparities in the education system can also be seen in how students are treated by race or ethnicity. So, for example, Black boys are 3 times more likely to be suspended than white boys. Black girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. There are also achievement gaps and other disparities by race in the education system. The public child welfare system. There are differences by race and ethnicity. For example, if we look at this graph, we see that the blue columns represent the percent of foster children, and the green columns are the percent of children. So let's look at non-Hispanic white children. They make up 52% of the population of children, and they are 42% of children in foster care. But when we look at the Black children, they make up 14% of the population, but 24% of the foster care population. There are small differences for Latino children. Asian children, it's the reverse, but when we look at Native American children, we can see that although they make up 1% of the child population, they're 2% of the foster care population. But these disparities by race aren't just about the makeup of the foster care population. Once children are in foster care, Black children, for example, are more likely to stay in foster care longer and have multiple placements. So that is what we mean by racism in the foster care system. Criminal justice. Right? We all know about the differences in terms of sentencing for the same crime by race. But let's look at how race influences convictions. So in this data, we can see that innocent Black people are more likely to be wrongfully convicted of crimes than innocent white people. They're 7 times more likely to be convicted for murder, 3.5 times more likely to be convicted for sexual assault, and 12 times more likely to be convicted of drug crimes. There's also disparities by race, in other words, racism, in healthcare. Let's look at diagnosis for breast cancer as just one example. So this displays the percent of women who are diagnosed at the different stages. So if we look at white non-Hispanic women, we see that about 54% of them are diagnosed at the earliest stage, stage 1. When we look at African American women, however, it's about 39%. So that's a big difference, right? 39% compared to about 53%. And then when we look at when they are diagnosed at the latest stage, right, in terms of stage 4, we can see that African American women, about 8%, it looks like, are diagnosed at stage 4 compared to about 5% for white non-Hispanic women. And then stage 3, about 16% of African American women are diagnosed at stage 3, whereas that rate is about 11% for white non-Hispanic women. And then you can look at the rates in between for Asian Pacific Islander and Hispanic women. But ultimately, this is just showing that certain minority groups are diagnosed later, which leads to more negative consequences in terms of mortality than white non-Hispanic women. There's racism in lending practices. But if we look at homeownership rates by race and educational attainment, so let's just first of all look at the less than high school group. When we look at just those, so all the folks who had less than a high school education, we see that, just comparing non-Hispanic white to Black Americans, we see the huge gap in home ownership. And this gap applies regardless of education. The gap definitely gets smaller as we increase in education, but even those who have a college education, just those who do, the gap between the white non-Hispanic Americans and Black Americans is still higher than 20%. And then this red line here was added to show that a non-Hispanic white American with a high school education is still more likely to own a home than a Black American with a college degree. And there are many more that I could go over, different institutions, but the key here is that the disproportionality that we see, these disparities, are based on institutional racism, the policies and practices that lead to disproportionality. Okay, so these are all examples of racism within a given institution. When we make the connections among those institutions, that is structural racism. So structural racism involves the connections among institutions that create and perpetuate hierarchies along racial and ethnic lines. So things like the school to prison pipeline, unemployment among foster youth, immigration policies that deny health care. So as you can see, these are examples of just two institutions being connected, leading to disproportionality, right? But when we look at all of this together, it creates a web of structural racism that ultimately creates a lack of access to opportunities for social and economic advancement. And we can see this the most when we look at the wealth gap. So white households without a college degree still have more wealth than Latinx and Black households with a college degree. Why is this important? Because when minority populations don't have access to mobility, to social and economic mobility, they are more likely to remain in a socioeconomic status that is far lower or less than their white counterparts. Okay? And that's structural racism. Ultimately, when we look at racism, whether it be at the individual, institutional, or structural level, we see that racism is made up of the belief in white superiority plus the power to do something, to act in a way that is harmful to people of color. Okay, so here are the sources of the images that I used. Thank you very much for viewing this video, and I will either see you in class or on here. Take care.